Speaking in good faith today with James Goldberg. James, thank you for coming in today.
Oh, it's so good to be here.
James is an American historian, a playwright, poet, and writer. He has Jewish, European, and Punjabi ancestors, and we'll talk about that and how that's come down and become commingled in your life and your experience. He attended Otterbein University briefly before transferring to Brigham Young University, where he completed his undergraduate work and earned a Master of Fine Arts degree and was an adjunct professor at BYU. He's founded two organizations, the Mormon Lit Blitz with his wife, Nicole Wilkes Goldberg, and the theatrical company New Play Project, and is a contributor to the Saints History Project with the LDS Church, and we'll come back to talk about that a little bit. Past president of the Association for Mormon Letters.
That's right.
Association
for Mormon Letters. It's really the Mormon literature, for study of Mormon literature, but they said letters when they founded it. So they could look for kind of the lyrical, interesting things in like pioneer journals and that sort of thing. They wanted a wide lens.
James has published 2 novels, 4 collections of poetry, 2 other books, and I know has projects going currently that we'll ask about.
That's right.
As well. So famously, at least, and interestingly to me, is your grandfather was the first of the Sikh tradition to join the LDS Church.
Yeah, as far as we know, right? Mm-hmm. It's possible. It's a big world, but he came from Punjab to the United States in the 1950s. His older sister, she was very close in age to him, and they were emotionally close. And she got sick, and at that time there just weren't enough hospitals, and they were closed at night. And so he went with her to the hospital. They tried to get in. Hospital said, "We can't take you till the morning," and she died. That night he was there. A couple months after that, maybe not even a couple months, his baby brother had just been born. There were 11 kids in the family, big Punjabi farming family. Mm-hmm. And he'd had health problems since he was born, and my grandpa would stay up at night giving him medicine, and then he also died. So when he came to the U.S. for education, was at Fresno State at first for college. He was also kind of looking for these religious answers. And, Latter-day Saint view of work in the spirit world and the idea that you can forge eternal families, even for people who never heard about these ideas in their life, really struck him powerfully. And after extended, I think he read Jesus the Christ as well as the standard works before he got baptized. Very systematic, but yeah, in the 1950s he got baptized, and as far as we know, he's the first Sikh.
So how much of that tradition were you aware of as a young man growing up, and what was the religious atmosphere in your home?
Yeah, I mean, so that's just my mom's side, and we'll get to my dad's side later. But like I said, he's one of 10 kids, right? And so there was a big extended family. A lot of his brothers ended up coming over to the U.S. And so summers, we were always spending time with them in California. A lot of them were farming still. And, of course, we had, like, family weddings and those kind of things. So I grew up around a lot of Sikhism. I remember my grandpa used to have stationery for Lion Sing Farms that his brother was doing the work at that time. He was still a math professor, but he was involved administratively. And so I was always drawing on these papers with that Lion Sing, which, like, the lion is a Sikh symbol. Singh is a person who's like a lion, right? Which is the name that all Sikh men take.
Correct, yes.
Women take the name Kaur, right? And so, anyway, so it was like part of my imagination-scape, I guess you could say, as a kid. And then my grandpa really felt like there's 10 Sikh gurus. He thought of them as prophets. And then Joseph Smith was just number 11, right? In this sort of continuation. So I don't think for him, his conversion felt in any way like a rejection of those Sikh roots. It felt like adding this additional layer. And so yeah, we very much grew up with stories of Sikh heroes and Sikh gurus and a deep respect for that tradition.
Which might seem really, if you belong to a church that has a president who is also a prophet, to seem very familiar.
Right. Right. Those things. I mean, and it's interesting. These are two of the youngest religious traditions in the world. Lots of churches and denominations, but sort of recognized as having a history, a culture. Both of them have sort of this place where they're the critical mass and there's a majority, and then a big diaspora where they're the minority. Have ended up crossing paths a lot in interfaith settings. And so yeah, I think it was a good way to grow up. And in our family, it did feel like that this wasn't competition. These were just two sources of truth to draw. And my brother used to joke that in some ways it's tough to grow up with three religions in the house, right? Because one you can reject. Once you have three religions telling you the same sort of thing, it's harder to get around.
There might be something.
Like, there's probably something there. Yeah.
Well, tell me about the Jewish tradition coming through your family.
So my dad's side of the family, his dad was Jewish. And he'd always call on the phone and used to kind of rib us about things like, how many Nobel Prizes have Mormons won? And later we finally got one. So, but again, one. So anyway, he'd send us books and things. I remember there was one called the Jewish 100 that was somebody's list of 100 influential Jews. And just personally, he was not religious, but invested in the tradition, right? And then there were other family members on that side who were different kinds of religious. And connected to Judaism in different ways. So I sort of got to see a spectrum. And then growing up, there were like some holidays that we would do. Hanukkah is really easy. Passover is like maybe my favorite holiday. I love Passover. And those were just ways of kind of holding on to that Jewish memory and a different way of looking at things, right?
So in 2020, now this says 2024 Storymakers Award. We're not in 2024.
That's
so
right.
I
so they're giving the awards in May, but they announced them this year. So Storymakers is a group of Latter-day Saint writers, a lot of them more commercial side, right, who are selling a lot more books than I do. But they have these awards named after Orson F. Whitney, who's a late 19th, early 20th century figure in the church who's a writer and an intellect, was also an apostle.
And had quite a vision for what literature could be.
Yes. He really believed that it was important to the Restoration Project, the Zion Project, that we have a literature of our own. And he's not the first person who felt that way. You can Sidney Rigdon gave a talk in Kirtland where he talks about the importance of building up literary institutions in Zion. And that's a mark of what we do. But Orson F. Whitney is the one who famously said, we should have Milton's and Shakespeare's of our own. Although that's not my favorite line from that address of his, which is called Home Literature. You can find it online. My favorite part is this metaphor he has about bees. Pioneers were into bees.
Yes.
And he says, he's addressing young Latter-day Saints, and he says, like bees do, you should go and gather nectar from all the literary traditions of the world, right? And bring it back where we should learn to be original. We should build our own hive and honeycomb. And I love that image, that we're building on other things everywhere, but then also trying to make a literature that is our own, where we have our own sort of styles and conversations where we speak our own language. And I think sometimes we can get caught up in that quest for greatness and miss that the important work is just really speaking deeply to what we have. And that's been important to me. But yeah, so they have an award named after Orson F. Whitney. And so this Outstanding Achievement Award, I'm a recipient.
So coming up in May, the 2024 Storymakers Award for your multi-faith writing. So that's not a big surprise that would be a possible thing you would do. So I would like to do two things. One, I kind of want to ask about the beginnings of your actual faith connection with God. And then to see how that plays in and how you bring in these different influences, because this is really fascinating to me, how you have maintained a connection and really honored those traditions that all come together in you. Did you always believe in God? You were obviously taught.
Yeah, I did. And not everybody does. And I think that makes sense, right? Like intellectually, totally get the questions. I think I've just more intuitively believed in that something. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and God and a reality beyond the side of reality that I can get on that intellectual level. And so I think really early intuitively, yeah, I just did believe in that. And then I think there's obviously layers to that belief building as I had different experiences where I would connect, say, a prophet. I remember Gordon B. Hinckley giving one particular address where I just felt that sort of prophetic force, right? Mm-hmm. That extra something beyond the words. And I went, yes, I've believed that we have prophets and this man is a prophet, but here's a moment where I felt the force of that. And I mean, I remember other moments too, though. Just one, my freshman year of college, I was in a 4th floor dormitory and looking out the window, kind of eye to eye with a tree, right? Trees are wonderful, right? They're so huge and they have this different scale that they exist on in time and space. And just really having in that moment that feeling of connection to creation very powerfully, right? That maybe like South Asian spirituality is better at explaining, but from a Latter-day Saint perspective, we believe too, right? That there's this spiritual power, this intelligence in everything, and feeling just for a moment really linked to that. So I think there's these lots of little spark moments for me that build on a gradual process of unfolding understanding.
So you've also, and you did serve a mission in the East German mission.
Yes, so it was Leipzig mission combined with Berlin, but in the former East Germany. And so that sort of different cultural experience there than if I'd been on the west side of that country.
But it seems like not only delving into the Latter-day Saint tradition, that you have taken the time to explore truths and culture in both the Sikh tradition and the Jewish traditions.
I mean, it's important to me, right? I want to figure out God. I want to figure out how this spiritual power works. I want to, I guess, scratch that itch. You talk about, there's this image that comes up in South Asian poetry a lot of the pearl, right? How a pearl comes from this itch.
Yes.
And you layer onto that. And I think for me, sometimes that edge of life and death, that edge of everyday reality and this bigger reality around us is that grain of sand that I'm constantly scratching at, right? And so I'm grabbing on whatever I can, right? There's so much in the Latter-day Saint tradition. Sometimes I say we've got the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, the stuff that's real, and we've got this Mormonism, just stuff, right? Here's all these different things that people have said and wondered through the years, and I'm interested in both. And then, yeah, I'm very interested in other religious philosophies. Obviously, I feel the most connection to the ones that I kind of grew up with, that I've got this family history, Spirit of Elijah connection to. But any religion, I feel like an attitude of curiosity can only serve you, right?
And so how has that served your what I'm picturing is that you're looking at God from different angles.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's, maybe you have a better metaphor. You are a poet, after all, but I'm just building on what you said. Do you feel like you've expanded your understanding because of those explorations?
I mean, I think so. No, definitely. So I'll give you one example, right? Latter-day Saints, one difference you find if you're doing interfaith discussions with like Protestants is you realize we talk about God as our Father and we mean that like really literally, where in a lot of Christian tradition that's more a metaphor. God loves us like a father, but we're creations, right? For some, there's this process by which you become a child of God. It's not the same as the Latter-day Saint belief. This is just what we are, right? But then when you go to the Dharmic faith, Sikhism, Hinduism, there's all this imagery of God as the ocean and we're a drop, right? That like a water cycle came out of God and is flowing back to merge into God.
A temporary separation from the whole.
Yes. And obviously as a Latter-day Saint, I view that merging back into God differently, right? I think of deification, exaltation, becoming like God, inheriting this full measure of godliness. And yet, this idea that we have a divine essence shows up in both. And I think in some ways, when you go to like a Sikh contemplative tradition, you think about that different ways, right? I think as Latter-day Saints, we think of exaltation so much forward-looking. Okay, I'm a child of God. That's important to me now, but I'm also trying to unfold this godliness. I think in Sikh tradition, children grow. But in Sikh tradition, there's more of a history of saying, how do you recognize just what's there now? What are ways that you can get in touch with that divine essence in the moment? And I think that's real. I think that's important. A different language maybe gets me there faster. I remember on my mission when we talked about restoration, what does restoration mean? And what do we believe about apostasy? We'd say, okay, here's Christ Church that has all these different parts, and we'd like take little cups and build a tower. And then, okay, if you take some apart, the tower falls down. But every religion's got a piece, right? And we believe we're putting pieces back together. And I remember one night saying to my missionary companion, if everybody's got a piece, they're probably better at it than we are, right? They've thought more about that aspect. And so yeah, that's one example, but we could go on, right? Judaism is one where this idea of like covenant history and God's memory, right? Unfolding under time. That's a huge theme of Book of Mormon. The word remember comes up again and again and again. And yet Judaism like has done a lot more work thinking about God over time, God in history, and what it means to remember through really difficult times. I think they've just thought about it in different ways than we, as this young tradition that claims really old roots. We've got important tools, but they're different ones, right? And so we're getting it at the same objective through different languages, different experiences.
So you've been a contributing writer to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints project, which is a series of books detailing the history of the church. It's called Saints. And if I can quote you here, it's a seismic shift in how Latter-day Saints are approaching our history. So there was a time, I think, when it was really emphasized that we should pick the most inspiring moment of someone's life or of us as a people. That's what should be foregrounded. But we live in a different time now where there's so much access to knowledge that I wonder if you talk about the thinking that led to this.
So when I did my Master's of Fine Arts studying creative nonfiction writing, how do you tell true stories in ways that are taking advantage of literary tools and ways of structuring things, I actually got really interested in online writing. So it's sort of weird because everybody else is doing essays and these sorts of things. And I'm like, okay, my thesis is going to be blogs, 3 interconnected blogs, and I'll reflect about that. But I did a lot of thinking and reading about online media, what they were calling new media then, and what are the mindsets that go with that. So then when I think about church history, and when I started in 2013 working for the church history department, an observation I had pretty early was that we've sort of passed through 3 cultures. The early saints had a very oral culture of history, right? What was Joseph Smith like? Well, somebody was there. Well into the end of the 19th century, you can go to testimony meetings where people are just telling Nauvoo stories still.
From their own lives.
From their own lives. And so that was the way people experienced history. And then sometime in the 20th century, it starts kind of picks up momentum over the early 20th century, but then definitely in the post-war years becomes dominant. Mass media, broadcast media becomes our model. And so that's how we start we're adapting and taking all these stories we've got and saying, how do we compress them down into one message? And in broadcast media, there really is one simple message that goes out. And we weren't the only organization doing this, right? Advertisements were the same way. You look at 1950s advertisements, it's one idealized message that just goes out, and everybody sort of knew that this is aspirational thinking, right? And what I've said about church history is in that era, we started taking what I call a mascot approach to church history, where we would take somebody like Joseph Smith and say, well, what do we believe in now? What are our values now? And how can stories about Joseph Smith represent all that? And Joseph was not always, I don't know how he would have felt about that, right? Because he was at an early stage in this process of God shaping a tradition. He doesn't necessarily, his life doesn't stand up. Self-reliance would be one, right? Here we have in Doctrine and Covenants, God telling Joseph Smith, you're never going to be good at money, Joseph, and that's not your calling, and it's okay. And yet, right, like we've kind of wanted him to stand in for all these virtues. So I think through the late 20th century, when I grew up, you had sort of one message going out, and it was this idealized message.
And wasn't that also during a time when the church really was hoping to have more mainstream acceptance?
I think that ties into it, right? That comes up in early 20th century. I think they're independent phenomena.
Okay.
But certainly when you say we're going to have one idealized message and it's going to be a message that we think can translate across difference, that can be more acceptable to the same sort of people, where in the 19th century, it's almost the opposite. We're trying to say, how do we declare independence? How do we make sure that we are not just sucked back into the gravity of the sort of Protestant majority religious discourse in this country?
So you mentioned three waves.
And then three waves, because now, once the internet comes around, you don't have organizations existing in a world where there's one message going out and everybody's sort of just passively receiving it, right? It's this much more multivocal environment. Everybody can say something. And so what are our expectations of story in a time when everyone can speak? And we start to value authenticity in a different way. We start to value just a diversity within a story in a different way. I used to joke with my colleagues, for everybody who leaves the church because they think it might not be true, there are two people who drift away because they know it's boring, right? This week-to-week experience, if they're still getting the one story, but they're living in this much more technicolor story world, it just gets dull, right? And that's a problem. So part of what we were trying to do, not only with Saints, but with that sort of generation of church history projects, is how do we speak in this different language that's multivocal, that's closer to the ground and lived experience, that doesn't make everybody be a mascot? But I said, now we should think of church history as laboratories of discipleship. We're trying stuff out, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. And both can be instructive. All these things, as the Doctrine and Covenants says, shall give thee experience and can be to thy good. And so we hoped if we could tell stories in a way that acknowledged those ups and downs, that readers would extend the charity to figures in the past to make up the difference and transform their failures into experience.
I think that's putting a great deal of trust in readership and a chance for growth from readers. And I'm curious, now that there's been enough time, I think, gone by that you can have, do you have a way of gauging reaction or feedback in different ways?
Right after Saints Volume 1 came out, I remember a friend, co-worker, who had a friend texting him sort of as she's reading.
So real-time.
Real-time reactions, right? And one of the things she said is, wow, it is incredible this church survived. And that's when I knew we'd succeeded. Because one of the things we wanted to do to the book, to use a phrase from Elder Uchtdorf, right? He said, we can't always see the end from the beginning, right? We're always stuck in this now. With history, we can see later, right?
Yeah.
It was important for us to help people read again in a way where they can't, and they're inhabiting that moment. And I do think what literature is good for is evoking empathy, right? Giving you a piece of the story so that you as the reader kind of bring the rest, bring your own emotional associations. And Saints, what that told me is Saints is working as literature. And here are people feeling along with the early saints. And so they recognize this was an experiment, right? And it's incredible that they were able to make it through. And yes, when you realize that that's an accomplishment, it's a little easier. I think we benefit more when we don't have the expectation that, of course, the first generation of saints, like mascots, had it all figured out and are perfect, and our job is just to live up to them. When we realize instead that we're together, we're co-creators in this story of discipleship, I think that's fundamentally a more healthy approach to our history. And I think saints communicated that, right? And as much as any detail, I think it's that mindset that we wanted to share.
So we can look back from our vantage point and see these people putting something together that monthly, if not daily, was receiving new information or was being formed in new ways, so that they had to constantly be adapting to the new information or what the new inspiration or current direction to move here or do this.
Yep.
And I think we like, as human beings, to think we're settled. Like, good thing they worked that out for us, and now everything is how it will be. We've had some recent shakeups, like, from 3-hour to 2-hour church, or things like that I think have maybe reminded people, we might still be in this ongoing experiment, which I think is mentally and spiritually healthy.
Yeah, I think that's good. And actually, I see you've got 5 books of Jesus here.
Yes, one of
There's
your
sort
books.
of an interesting influence line. So as a grad student, I was able to work as a research assistant for the Joseph Smith papers, which was really kind of bold. Kate Arowski, who ran the student research team, made it a point to always have somebody, a person or two from the English department there, because she said, we want some different perspectives. We don't just want the historical tool set. And then we want to invest in a future where people from different fields have been exposed to details of church history. So I was working with these Joseph Smith era documents, and it got me thinking about, how does this sausage get made as a religion is coming into being, right? What does that look like on the ground? And then I kind of turned around and thought about the New Testament that way, right? What might this have looked like from the perspective of early disciples and apostles who, the Gospels are very clear, had no idea what was happening next, right? And even things Jesus tried to express to them blindside them. So right after grad school, the first project I'd worked on was a retelling of the Gospels informed by early Latter-day Saint history, in the sense that how do we tell the gospel story in a way that immerses you in the world, that gets you thinking in that now, and that's told close to the ground from the perspective of the sort of everyday saints around Jesus. And then it was having worked on 5 books of Jesus and told the story that way, that ended up being the sort of narrative basis for how we told Saints, right? Because I had experience for how do we tell this story in a more literary approach. Now when we're coming back home, how do we do it again? So I think there's been this interesting interplay in my life between historical material and literary tools as you're trying to make meaning, as you're trying to help other people figure out what maybe discipleship felt like, what it felt like for these people to be scratching at that edge of reality, not always knowing what's going to appear next, what's the next layer in that pearl that God is giving us.
I have like 20 questions, and they're all headed different ways because of the way that you're thinking and you're talking is, is casting a really wide net on human experience, but also but zeroing in on how that happens in this particular denomination. I want to ask just a little bit about the connection between, usually we think someone has talents. So-and-so can sing. They're just born singing. Somebody else can see how to put mechanical things together. But I think those must also be spiritual gifts or connected to us. I'm wondering how you see your literary propensities, your understanding of poetry and story and all of that as a spiritual gift, if you do.
No, I think that's a good perspective on it. I guess I haven't thought a ton right in those terms, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's making me wonder now if part of spiritual gift is just like, where does your obsessive attention go, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that's...
And it's that direction.
Yeah. Part of what literature is just obsessive attention towards some questions, right? Part of it is like, how do you boil down experience into some language? Part of it is that being really precise about kind of the contradictions of what does life feel like, right? Where a lot of us might say, oh, how are you doing? I'm fine, right? Literary interest is just drilling down on that, right? And getting the contours. So is it a spiritual gift? Is it a way to think of spiritual gift that what's given is partly not the ability, but where the attention goes? And I think for like a gift of healing, that's not a bad way to think of it, right? That some people have a gift of focusing attention toward like what's wrong and how do you act as a salve to this? How do you address this? And yeah, maybe artistic sensibilities operate in a really similar way. Certainly, I think it's true that in the way that a diversity of spiritual gifts fit together to shape and inform this whole, this body of Christ, literary and other artistic sensibilities, I feel like are really important to holistic spiritual life, but not the only way to think of it, right? Like we've got to remember that they're balanced out by other ways of seeing, other ways of knowing.
Other ways of seeing, other ways of knowing. Excuse me. I'm wondering if I can ask you to act as a small letter G guru for a moment. With what I think is a head start you have on the whole concept that we've been encouraged by Russell M. Nelson, current president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to become aware of and even to root out prejudice of all kinds, both for people's origins, for race, for language, for whatever it might be, all types of prejudice. And first of all, I'm wondering, are you surprised because you have investigated and pulled together so many different parts of your heritage that it seems must give you a wider view of admiration and love for these different traditions and people who speak different languages, are different races, come from different countries and cultures? Are you ever surprised by narrow-mindedness from people who haven't experienced that? Or how would you encourage us to do better?
Here's what I would say. So rooting out prejudice goes hand in hand with building up affection. I remember we had, I grew up mostly in Columbus, Ohio, and we had good Congolese friends in our ward. And I remember my little sister, she must have been like 5 or 6 at the time, going over one night to Magango's and coming back and saying like, oh, it just smells so weird there. Like I'm not sure I trust this cooking. It smells weird. And I'm 12 years older than that sister, right? So would have been in high school, late high school. And I already knew other people think we smell weird, right? Because Indian food has a strong smell. And what you cook, and sometimes you, right? Because if you've got that smell on you still, when you're going to school, like if people didn't grow up with it, they notice, they're attuned. And since then, I remember talking to people about how if we want to build tolerance, right, you got to teach the nose and not just the mind. It's not only an abstract thing. We've got to be experientially exposed to one another. And I do think you get cumulative strength, right? I don't know every culture in the world, but I've gotten used to navigating multiple cultures. And at that point, when I smell something new, I don't go, this is weird. I go, this is new, right? This is different. And I can approach it with curiosity.
That's a really great differentiation. This isn't necessarily weird, which sometimes equates to scary, threatening.
Yeah, scary, negative, yep.
But new.
Yep.
To be understood.
Yes. But I do think it's a process, right? And I think a lot of times because there are negative moral effects to prejudice, we approach that question through a very moralizing lens to go, oh, if you're prejudiced, you're a bad person, right? But a lot of what that seems to lead to is just denial, that people have a hard time dealing with prejudice because you can't talk about it. And I wish we'd say more, okay, yes, sometimes there's negative effects. If I were building buildings, there would be negative effects because I'm not a good carpenter. I'm not a good architect. I would need to learn some things.
Right.
And so, yeah, we need to nurture intercultural affection. And I actually think a lot of places, a Latter-day Saint ward can be a really effective place to do that because you've got the tools there. You know people who you're already going to spend time with. It's not an extra task. The thing you need is the curiosity. And a lot of times you need to give other people permission to share because some people get used to those negative feedback signals of, oh, that's weird, that's strange. And so there's a tendency to sort of shell up and not necessarily share everything. And so I think if in a ward, if you can be proactive about asking other people and inviting them and giving them positive feedback when they share some things that are unique about their family and background, whatever they look like, right? You might be surprised sometimes what you find out about somebody you would have expected had a similar experience to you, and they didn't. But I think as we proactively give permission and people share, there can start to be this positive feedback effect, right? Where we come to appreciate each other and through that build up these skills that we can then take to lots of different experiences. And I should say a lot of Latter-day Saints are also good about getting out proactively into interfaith spaces outside of the church. And that can be a really quick, important way to do that, right? It's just spending time together, serving shoulder to shoulder alongside each other. You start to get used to things. And I think, yeah, the kind of affection and tolerance that builds up naturally that way is a really helpful angle to do some of this rooting out of attitudes you don't even realize you have because they're just an inherited part of the culture you got.
Yeah. It would be nice if we could all say we all are prejudiced just by nature of we grew up someplace different than somebody else grew up, and there are thus unknowns and things we're inexperienced with. And acknowledging that can be so useful. And I love what you just said because about being in each other's spaces and working in interfaith ways, because I've realized over the last maybe 10, maybe more years, the joy I find when I go into a gurdwara, a Sikh place of worship, or a synagogue, or a mosque, is different than, I wouldn't say fear, but trepidation I had as a younger person going to those places. Mostly the fear that I would do or say something offensive or wrong to those people.
Yeah. That's interesting, right? And I think a lot of us, that there is that anxiety and nervousness. And it's kind of going and doing and maybe making the mistakes that helps overcome that, because you realize, like, most of the time people are pretty affectionate in helping you feel welcome and understand what to do. And it's okay that you don't know everything, right?
2 months ago, or within the last 2 months, we were at a Sikh Gurdwara, and we were speaking to the folks there, and very happy to be there. And as you do, I turned to talk to one of them, and he very gently said, "While we're in this room, we always face the holy book,
Yeah.
the guru,
Yep.
and we don't turn our backs. And I thought that was so simple. And so it was just a bit of information he shared, like, oh, you might not know this, but, and so we continued our conversation sort of shoulder to shoulder, facing, not turning our backs to the book. That was so easily done and so effortlessly done, and I really appreciated learning it.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember on my mission having a companion who was just really good at speaking bad German. And I admired that so much, right? Because that's how you learn a language more quickly, is by being willing to just sort of
He would just
try
launch into
and
it.
throw stuff out, and people listen, and largely people, right, like respond affectionately. And with our kids, right? When you see little kids make a mistake, most of the time the instruction is pretty gentle, and we can learn with that. And if sometimes it's less gentle, we can get through that too, you know.
I wonder, one of the projects you're doing right now and looking to the future is a serialized version of, it's for Wayfair magazine, which is new, called the Helm First Ward, I believe. Am I saying that correctly?
You're saying that more correctly than I do. So I usually just say Kelm to anglicize it a little more, but that's correct. Yep. But yeah, so Kelm there's old Ashkenazi, Eastern European Jewish stories about this village of village idiots, right? Which is Kelm, which actually is a real town in Poland. I don't know how they feel about being the star of all these stories. And it's a way to think through, they'll approach problems with this sort of bent logic, right? Where there is a logic to the way they approach it, but it's just off. And so so my wife and my brother and I got together several years ago and started tossing around ideas for, like, okay, what would it be like in the Kelm ward? And
a ward being a Latter-day Saint
ward being a Latter-day
congregation.
Saint ward. If some of the fools in the city of fools somehow ended up becoming Latter-day Saints, how would they approach problems? And so it's this way to use satire, right? Yeah. To question ways we approach things, but affectionate satire.
Affectionate. Like in the very introduction, you talk about a sister who's the president of the women's organization, and she felt her gift of talking was to help relieve others of the burden of having to speak.
That's right.
In meetings. And
That's right.
In other words, she was just going to say it all.
And so you, as a reader, recognize, oh, this is somebody who talks a lot. That's a negative thing, but you can see from her point of view how this is maybe positive. It's bend, it's backward logic, but hopefully what it does is teaches you, when you see that person in your ward, to not take it so personally, or in yourself.
Or in your mirror. Yeah.
Yes, in your mirror.
Well, I think you've just sort of unveiled one of the beauties of literature, is that we can do some exploration like that even in the comfort of our own homes as we read. If we're really mindful of what we're reading, we can discover something.
Yes, and that's back to Orson F. Whitney, right? When he said, go and gather the nectar everywhere and then bring it back and make your own honey, right? Even from your home, you can go and gather nectar widely, but then maybe when you bring it back to your own life, the way you make meaning, the way you build things up, there's new insights and there's new ways of thinking as you're processing nectar into honey.
James Goldberg, fascinating to speak with you, and I hope it's not the last time. Thank you for speaking with me in good faith.
Oh, always nice to talk.